The stagecoach lurched to a stop in front of the Monticello trading post, and Winifred Palmer knew immediately that something was very wrong with her hands. She had been clutching them together inside her thin coat for the past 6 hours, ever since the temperature had plummeted somewhere in the mountains between Salt Lake City and this small Utah settlement. The driver had offered her a blanket, but it had been so threadbare that the wind had cut right through it. Now, as she tried to uncurl her fingers to gather her belongings, she realized she could not feel them at all. The skin had gone from painful to numb, and when she looked down, her fingertips were an alarming shade of grayish white. Miss, this is your stop." The driver's weathered face appeared in the doorway, his expression shifting from impatience to concern as he took in her condition. "Lord Almighty, your hands." Winifred tried to speak, but her teeth were chattering too violently. She was 22 years old and had traveled all the way from Philadelphia to marry a man she had never met, a rancher named Gerald Hutchins, who had promised her a good home and security. She had left behind nothing but debt and her mother's grave, arriving in this frontier town on a February afternoon in 1878 with little more than hope and determination. "We need to get you inside," the driver said, reaching for her arm. "Can you walk?" She nodded, though her legs felt stiff and uncooperative as she descended from the coach. The cold air hit her like a physical blow and she stumbled. The driver caught her, then looked around frantically. "Someone get help. This woman needs warming up right now." A small crowd had gathered, as crowds always did when the stage arrived in small towns. Most of them stared with curiosity but did not move. Winifred felt humiliation wash over her, adding to her misery. This was not how she had imagined her arrival, collapsing in the street like some helpless creature. Then a man pushed through the onlookers, and Winifred found herself looking up into a pair of concerned brown eyes set in a sun-weathered face. He was tall, perhaps 27 or 28, with dark hair that curled slightly at his collar and a strong jaw shadowed with stubble. "What happened?" His voice was deep and steady, the kind of voice that suggested competence. "Frostbite, I think," the driver said. "Been 6 hours in that cold coach with nothing but a rag for warmth." The man did not hesitate. "My ranch is closest. Bring her." "Now wait just a minute," said another voice, and an older man with a silver mustache stepped forward. "I am Gerald Hutchins. This woman is my intended bride. I will take care of her." Winifred looked at the man who was supposed to become her husband. He was perhaps 50, with cold blue eyes and thin lips pressed into a disapproving line. He was looking at her not with concern but with something closer to annoyance, as though she had inconvenienced him by arriving in such a state. The younger man seemed to sense her hesitation. "Mr. Hutchins, with respect, Frostbite is serious. She needs warming immediately and my place is a 5-minute walk. Yours is what, 40 minutes by wagon? I do not appreciate you interfering in my business, Dalton." "I am not interfering, sir. I am trying to help save this woman's hands. You are welcome to come along." The man named Dalton was already moving, gently taking Winifred's elbow. His touch was careful, respectful. "Can you walk, miss?" "I think so," she managed through her chattering teeth. Gerald Hutchins made a sound of displeasure, but did not try to stop them as Dalton led her away from the trading post. Another man appeared at Dalton's side, younger, perhaps 20 or so, with the same brown eyes and similar features. "Brother, what is happening?" "Get the fire built up high, Thomas. Hot water towels. This woman has frostbite." Thomas took off running, and Dalton continued to guide Winifred down the frozen street. She was aware of people watching, of whispers following them, but Dalton seemed unconcerned with propriety. His focus was entirely on getting her to shelter. The ranch house appeared ahead, a sturdy log structure with smoke already rising from the chimney. Thomas must have arrived and stoked the fire. Dalton helped her up the steps and through the door, and the warmth inside was so sudden and overwhelming that Winifred's knees buckled. Dalton caught her easily, his arms strong and sure. "Easy now. Thomas, help me get her to the chair by the fire." They settled her in a large wooden chair pulled close to the hearth, and Winifred finally allowed herself to look at her hands properly. They were worse than she had thought, the grayish-white extending past her fingertips to her knuckles. She had heard stories about frostbite, about people losing fingers and toes. Fear clenched in her chest. "Am I going to lose them?" Her voice came out small and frightened. Dalton knelt in front of her, his face level with hers. "Not if I can help it, but I need to warm them slowly. Too fast and we will do more damage. Do you understand?" She nodded. "Good. This is going to hurt. When the feeling comes back, it is going to hurt quite a bit, but that pain will mean healing." He looked up at Thomas. "Get me that bowl of lukewarm water." Thomas brought a ceramic bowl and Dalton tested the water with his elbow. Satisfied, he looked back at Winifred. "May I?" She extended her hands, and he took them gently in his own. His hands were large, calloused from work, warm against her frozen skin. He lowered her hands into the water and she gasped at the sensation. It did not feel warm to her, it felt burning hot, though she knew logically it could not be. "I know," Dalton said softly. "Just breathe." She tried to pull her hands back instinctively, but he held them steady, not roughly but firmly. "I've got you. Stay with me." Thomas appeared with blankets, draping them around her shoulders. "Should I get Doc Morrison?" "Not yet. Let us see if we can bring the feeling back first." Dalton kept his eyes on Winifred's face. "What is your name?" "Winifred Palmer." "I am Dalton Sawyer. This is my brother Thomas. You came to marry Gerald Hutchins." She nodded, watching as he lifted her hands from the water after a minute and dried them carefully with a soft towel. Then he cupped them between his own hands, his palms warm and dry, and began to very gently massage them. "How did you end up in such a state?" His voice was conversational, clearly trying to distract her from the discomfort. "The stagecoach driver said the weather turned worse than expected. We got caught in the mountains. I had a coat, but it was not very warm." She had sold her good winter coat to pay for part of her passage west, a decision that now seemed catastrophically foolish. Dalton frowned. Hutchins should have sent money for proper travel clothing. "He sent what he could, I suppose." "Did he?" Dalton's tone suggested doubt, but he did not press the issue. Instead, he continued his gentle ministrations, his thumbs working in small circles over her palms, his fingers carefully flexing hers. Thomas brought hot coffee, and Dalton released one of her hands long enough for her to take a few sips. The warmth spread through her chest, and combined with the fire and the blankets, she finally stopped shivering quite so violently. "Feeling anything yet?" Dalton asked, reclaiming her hand and continuing his massage. "A little. Tingling." "Good. That is good." He seemed genuinely pleased, and she found herself studying his face more closely. He had laugh lines around his eyes and a small scar on his chin. His hands, still holding hers, were patient and careful. She realized this man, this stranger, was showing her more tenderness in these few minutes than anyone had in a very long time. "Why are you doing this?" she asked suddenly. He looked up, surprised. "What do you mean? You do not know me." "You could have let Mr. Hutchins take me, and let you lose your hands because he was too proud to accept help." "No," Dalton shook his head. "Besides, it is just human decency, is it not? You needed help, I could provide it. Not everyone would." Something flickered in his eyes, an understanding that made her think he knew something about being in need of help and not receiving it. "Well, I am not everyone." They sat in silence for a while, Dalton continuing to warm her hands in his, the fire crackling beside them. Gradually, the tingling increased, becoming almost painful. Winifred winced, and Dalton immediately adjusted his pressure. "Talk to me," he said. "Tell me about Philadelphia." So she did. She told him about growing up in the city, about her father who had died when she was young, about her mother who had worked herself to exhaustion as a seamstress. She told him about her mother's illness, the medical bills, the debt collectors. She did not tell him about the landlord who had suggested an alternative payment arrangement with a leer that had made her skin crawl, or about the nights she had gone to bed hungry so her mother could eat. But perhaps he heard those things anyway in what she did not say, because his expression grew soft with sympathy. "And Hutchins offered you a way out," he said quietly. "He offered me a future, security, a home." She looked down at their joined hands. "I know it is not romantic, but romance is a luxury I could not afford." "Everyone deserves romance," Dalton said, then seemed to catch himself. "I mean, everyone deserves kindness at least, respect." The pain in her hands was intensifying, and she gasped. Dalton immediately dipped them back in the water, which Thomas had been replacing periodically with slightly warmer batches. The relief was immediate but temporary. "It hurts," she admitted, tears springing to her eyes. "I know. But look." He lifted her hands from the water and showed her. The color was returning, the grayish-white fading to pink. "The feeling is coming back. That pain means healing." He dried her hands again and returned to warming them in his own. This time, when he pressed his palms against hers, she could actually feel the texture of his skin, the calluses, the warmth. It was such a relief that she did let a few tears fall. "You are doing so well," he murmured, and there was such genuine warmth in his voice that more tears came. Thomas appeared again, this time with soup. "Thought you might be hungry, miss." "Thank you." She was famished, actually, but when she tried to take the bowl, her hands were still too weak and clumsy. Before she could feel embarrassed, Dalton took the bowl and spoon. "Let me." It should have been humiliating, being fed like a child. But Dalton did it with such matter-of-fact kindness that it did not feel demeaning. He was simply helping someone who needed help. The soup was rich and warming, and she realized it had been nearly a full day since she had eaten. "This is very good," she said after several spoonfuls. "Thomas is the cook in this family," Dalton said with a smile at his brother. "I can barely manage to not burn coffee." Thomas grinned. "That is the truth. Last week he tried to make biscuits and they came out harder than rocks. We gave them to the pigs and even they would not eat them." Despite everything, Winifred laughed. It felt strange laughing, but also good. Dalton's eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, she noticed. It transformed his whole face. By the time she finished the soup, full feeling had returned to her hands. They still ached, a deep throbbing pain, but they were pink and warm and responsive when she flexed her fingers. Dalton examined them carefully, his touch clinical now, checking each finger. "I think you will be all right," he said finally. "No permanent damage that I can see, but you will need to be careful for the next few days. Keep them warm and dry." "How did you know what to do?" "Lost a cow to frostbite my first winter here. Did not know how to treat it properly, and by the time I learned, it was too late. After that, I made sure I knew. Figured if it could happen to cattle, it could happen to people too." He released her hands, and she was surprised by how much she missed the warmth of his touch. "You should rest." That stagecoach ride must have been exhausting even without the cold. She was exhausted, now that he mentioned it. The warmth and food and relief had left her feeling heavy and drowsy. "I should not impose on you any longer. Perhaps I could go to the hotel, or Mr. Hutchins could come fetch me." "You will do no such thing," Thomas said firmly. You are in no condition to travel anywhere right now. You can take the spare room. It is small, but the bed is comfortable." Winifred looked between the two brothers uncertainly. "I could not. People will talk." "Let them talk," Dalton said. "Your health is more important than gossip. Besides, Thomas and I are both here. It is hardly improper." She was too tired to argue, and truthfully, she did not want to see Gerald Hutchins tonight. The way he had looked at her at the trading post had made her uneasy. "Thank you. You are both very kind." Thomas showed her to the spare room, which was indeed small but clean and cozy. There was a quilt on the bed that looked handmade, and a basin with fresh water. He brought her traveling bag, which the stagecoach driver must have left, and built up the fire in the small hearth. "Holler if you need anything," he said. "We will be just down the hall." After he left, Winifred sank onto the bed, her hands still aching but functional. She looked around the simple room and thought about the chain of events that had led her here. If the stagecoach had been warmer, if her coat had been heavier, if Gerald Hutchins had insisted on taking her himself, she would not be in this house right now. She would not have met Dalton Sawyer. And that thought troubled her more than it should, because in just a few hours, this man had shown her more genuine care than her intended husband had in 6 months of correspondence. She changed into her nightgown, grateful that her hands were working well enough to manage the buttons. When she slipped under the quilt, she found it was as warm and comfortable as Thomas had promised. But as she drifted off to sleep, it was not thoughts of her approaching marriage that filled her mind. It was the memory of strong, gentle hands warming hers and brown eyes full of concern. Morning came with pale winter sunlight streaming through the small window. For a moment, Winifred was disoriented, unsure where she was. Then memory returned, the cold, the fear, Dalton's kindness. She sat up and examined her hands. They were still slightly pink and tender, but the feeling was completely back. She flexed her fingers experimentally and felt only a dull ache. There were voices coming from somewhere else in the house, low and conversational. She dressed quickly in her best day dress, a modest blue wool that had been her mother's and which she had altered to fit herself. It was not fancy, but it was respectable and warm. She braided her dark blonde hair and pinned it up, then took a deep breath before venturing out of the room. The voices were coming from the kitchen. She followed them and found Dalton and Thomas at a rough-hewn table, eating breakfast. A pot of coffee sat on the stove, and the smell made her stomach growl. "Good morning," Dalton said, rising immediately. "How are your hands?" "Much better." "Thanks to you." She showed him, and he took them gently, examining them with the same careful attention he had shown the night before. "Good. The color is much better." He released her hands and pulled out a chair. "Please sit. Have you eaten?" Thomas was already dishing up a plate of eggs and bacon before she could answer. "Coffee, please." She sat, and they fell into an easy conversation about the ranch, the weather, the town. Dalton and Thomas had inherited the property from their father 3 years ago, she learned. They ran cattle and did some horse breeding. It was hard work, especially in winter, but they were making it succeed. "You have other family?" she asked. A shadow crossed both their faces. "Our mother died when Thomas was born," Dalton said quietly. "Our father died of a heart condition 3 years ago. It is just the two of us now. I am sorry. So are we, but we have each other." Dalton smiled at his brother, and the affection between them was clear. "What about you? Any siblings?" "No, it was just my mother and me. She passed 6 months ago." "I am sorry," Dalton said, and she could tell he meant it. "That must have been very difficult." "It was, still is." She found herself wanting to tell him more about her mother's gentle nature and fierce love, about the hole her absence had left. But before she could, there was a knock at the door. Dalton and Thomas exchanged glances. That will be Hutchins, Dalton said, rising. I will get it. Winifred's stomach clenched with anxiety. She was not ready for this, not ready to face the man she was supposed to marry. But she stood, smoothing her skirt, trying to compose herself. Gerald Hutchins strode into the kitchen as though he owned it, his cold blue eyes sweeping over the scene with clear disapproval. Miss Palmer, I trust you have recovered from your unfortunate incident. Yes, sir. Thanks to Mr. Sawyer's quick assistance. Indeed. Hutchins did not look at Dalton. Well, I have come to collect you. We have much to discuss. There was something about his tone, about the way he was already treating her like property he had purchased, that made Winifred's spine stiffen. Of course. Though perhaps we could speak here first. I feel I should become better acquainted with you before we make any final arrangements. Hutchins's expression hardened. Final arrangements. We have an agreement, Miss Palmer. I paid for your passage. You came here to marry me. I came here to consider marrying you, she corrected carefully. Our correspondence suggested we would meet and ensure we were suited to each other before making any final commitment. I am suited just fine. The question is whether you are going to honor your word. Dalton stepped forward. Mr. Hutchins, the lady has just recovered from a serious medical situation. Perhaps you could show some consideration. I do not recall asking for your opinion, Sawyer. Hutchins finally looked at him, his gaze contemptuous. You have already interfered quite enough. I saved her hands. For which I am grateful, but that does not give you any claim on her. I am not claiming anything. I am simply suggesting you treat her with basic human decency. The two men stared at each other, tension crackling in the air. Winifred felt she should intervene, but she was frozen, caught between fear of Hutchins and appreciation for Dalton's defense of her. Finally, Hutchins turned back to her. Miss Palmer, gather your things. We are leaving. Give her a moment, Thomas said quietly. She has not finished her breakfast. I am not asking for your input either, boy. Thomas bristled at being called boy, but Dalton put a hand on his shoulder. The gesture was protective, calming. Then Dalton looked at Winifred, really looked at her, and something in his eyes seemed to be asking a question. Do you want to go with him? The truthful answer was no. Everything in her rebelled at the idea of leaving this warm kitchen with these kind men to go with Gerald Hutchins. But what choice did she have? He had paid for her passage. She had agreed to come. She had nowhere else to go and no money to get there if she did. I will get my things, she said softly, not meeting anyone's eyes. She went to the spare room and packed her few belongings with shaking hands. Through the door, she could hear voices, Hutchins speaking in low, angry tones, Dalton responding with forced calm. She could not make out the words, but the tone was clear enough. When she returned to the kitchen, Hutchins took her bag without a word and headed for the door. Winifred followed, but paused at the threshold to look back at Dalton and Thomas. Thank you, she said, for everything. I will not forget your kindness. Dalton looked like he wanted to say something, his jaw working, but he only nodded. Take care of your hands, keep them warm. Then she was out the door and climbing into Hutchins's wagon. He did not help her up, forcing her to manage on her own. As they pulled away from the ranch house, she looked back once and saw Dalton standing in the doorway, watching. The ride to Hutchins's ranch was conducted in tense silence. Winifred tried several times to start a conversation, to bridge the awkward gap between them, but Hutchins answered in monosyllables or not at all. His ranch, when they arrived, was larger than the Sawyer spread, with a bigger house and more outbuildings. But it felt cold somehow, unwelcoming. A housekeeper, a thin woman named Mrs. Crowley, showed Winifred to a room. Mr. Hutchins says you will be married tomorrow, she said, her tone neutral. I will help you prepare. Tomorrow, Winifred felt panic rising. That seems very fast. Mr. Hutchins does not believe in long engagements, says they are a waste of time. Mrs. Crowley looked at her with something that might have been pity. If you need anything, let me know. After she left, Winifred sank onto the bed and tried to calm her racing heart. Tomorrow. She was getting married tomorrow to a man she had spoken to for perhaps 5 minutes total, a man who made her uneasy in ways she could not fully articulate. But what choice did she have? The rest of the day passed in a blur. Mrs. Crowley brought her meals, helped her press her one good dress, explained the household routines. Hutchins himself did not appear, apparently occupied with ranch business. Winifred tried to tell herself this was normal, that many marriages started with less acquaintance than this, that she would grow accustomed to him in time. But that night, lying in the unfamiliar bed, all she could think about was the warmth of Dalton's hands around hers, the gentle concern in his voice, the way he had looked at her like she mattered. Morning came too soon. Mrs. Crowley helped her dress and arranged her hair. The local minister arrived, along with a few of Hutchins's ranch hands to serve as witnesses. Hutchins himself appeared in a clean shirt and vest, his expression as cold as ever. They gathered in the parlor, and the minister began the ceremony. Winifred heard her own voice responding mechanically to the questions, watched as though from a great distance as Hutchins placed a simple gold band on her finger. The minister was just beginning to pronounce them man and wife when the front door burst open. Dalton Sawyer stood in the doorway, breathing hard as though he had been running. His eyes found Winifred immediately. "Stop," he said. Everyone turned to stare at him. Hutchins's face went red with rage. "What is the meaning of this?" "I am sorry," Dalton said, though he was looking at Winifred, not Hutchins. "I know I have no right, but I cannot let this happen without at least asking. Do you want this? Do you truly want to marry him?" The room erupted in chaos. Hutchins was shouting. The minister was sputtering. The ranch hands were muttering. But Winifred heard none of it. She was looking at Dalton, at the hope and fear warring in his expression, at the way his hands were clenched at his sides as though it was taking all his restraint not to reach for her. She looked at Hutchins, at his furious face, then back at Dalton. "I do not know. You are my wife," Hutchins snapped. "The ceremony is nearly complete." "But it is not complete," Dalton said. "And from what I understand of the law, she has not signed any papers yet. She is not bound to you. I paid for her passage. I will repay you. Every cent." Dalton took a step forward, his eyes still locked on Winifred. "I know we have only just met. I know I have no claim on you, no right to ask anything of you, but I have not been able to stop thinking about you. And I have to know, is this what you want? Because if it is not, if there is even a chance you might want something different, then I am asking you to come with me instead." "This is preposterous," the minister said. "Young man, you cannot simply interrupt a wedding." "I just did." Dalton extended his hand toward Winifred. "What do you say? Will you take a chance on me?" Winifred looked at his outstretched hand, remembering how those hands had saved hers, how gently they had held her, how warm they had been. She looked at Hutchins, at the rage and possessiveness in his face, at the future of cold obligation stretching before her. And she looked at Dalton, at the hope and vulnerability in his eyes, at the possibility of something different. She pulled the ring off her finger and placed it on the table. Then she walked across the room and put her hand in Dalton's. "Yes," she said simply. His fingers closed around hers, warm and sure, and the smile that broke across his face was like sunrise. "Thank you. You will not regret this, I swear it." "You little fool," Hutchins snarled. "He is half as wealthy as I am. What can he possibly offer you?" Winifred looked back at him, and for the first time in her life she felt truly brave. Kindness, respect, the chance to be more than property. Dalton kept her hand in his as they walked out of the house together. His horse was tied outside and he helped her up, then swung up behind her. His arm came around her waist, steadying her, and she leaned back into the solid warmth of him. "Are you sure about this?" she asked as they rode away. "You do not really know me. I know enough. I know you are brave, crossing the country alone. I know you are strong, enduring what you endured yesterday. I know you deserve better than a man who treats you like a purchase." He paused. "But you are right that we do not know each other well, so here is what I propose. Come back to my ranch. Stay as long as you like. Get to know me and Thomas. Decide if you want to build a life with us. No obligation, no pressure, just possibility. And if I decide I do not want to stay, then I will help you go wherever you want to go. I will make sure you have money and safety. I promise." She believed him. That was the remarkable thing. After less than a day of real acquaintance, she believed this man would keep his word. "What about the gossip? I cannot stay at your ranch unchaperoned again. We will find a solution. Perhaps Mrs. Henderson in town needs a boarder. Or maybe Thomas can stay with a friend and I can bunk in the barn. We will figure it out properly." He urged the horse faster. "First, let us just get home." Home. He had called it home, not my house or the ranch, but home, and something in Winifred's chest loosened at the word. They rode in comfortable silence for a while, and then Dalton spoke again. "I have a confession to make. Last night I could not sleep. I kept thinking about you marrying Hutchins, about how wrong it felt. Thomas told me I was being foolish, that it was none of my business. But this morning I woke up and realized I could not live with myself if I did not at least try. Even if you had said no, I had to ask. I am glad you did. So am I." His arm tightened around her waist just slightly. "I am glad you said yes too." When they reached the ranch, Thomas came running out, his face a mixture of hope and concern. "Did you actually do it? Did you interrupt the wedding?" "I did." "And she came with you?" Thomas looked at Winifred in amazement. "You actually said yes?" "I did," she said, echoing Dalton's words with a small smile. "Ha!" Thomas threw his hat in the air. I told you to go after her. Dalton, you actually listened to me for once. You told him to come." Winifred looked between the brothers. Thomas grinned. "I have never seen my brother act the way he did after you left yesterday. He was miserable, kept walking to the window, watching the road like a lost puppy. Finally, this morning I said if he did not go get you, he would regret it for the rest of his life. I am glad he finally took my advice." Dalton looked slightly embarrassed. "Yes, well, sometimes even you have good ideas, little brother." They went inside, and Winifred felt a sense of rightness settle over her. This house, with its worn furniture and crackling fire and easy laughter, felt more like home than anywhere she had been in years. "Now," Dalton said, once they were settled at the kitchen table with coffee, "we need to address the practical matters. Winifred, you are absolutely right that you cannot stay here without a chaperone. That would be improper and would damage your reputation. So here is what I am thinking. There is a widow in town, Mrs. Henderson, who rents rooms. I will pay for you to board there. You can come visit the ranch during daylight hours with Thomas as chaperone. We will court properly the way you deserve. Does that sound acceptable? You do not have to pay for my boarding. I want to. Please, let me do this." His eyes were earnest. "I know you did not come all this way expecting to have to find lodging and work. Let me help until you decide what you want to do." "I will find work," she said firmly. "I will not be a burden." "You could never be a burden, but I understand wanting to contribute. Mrs. Henderson might need help with her boarding house. And I know the mercantile owner mentioned needing someone to help with bookkeeping." They talked through the details, making plans, and Winifred felt a weight lifting from her shoulders. She had a path forward, one that was her own choice. That night, After Dalton had settled her at Mrs. Henderson's boarding house and explained the situation, she lay in bed feeling more hopeful than she had in months. Mrs. Henderson proved to be a cheerful woman in her 60s who was delighted to have a long-term boarder. "Gets lonely in the winter," she said. "Company will be nice, and if you want to help with the cooking and cleaning, I can reduce your rent." So Winifred fell into a routine. She helped Mrs. Henderson in the mornings, working on the accounts in the afternoon at the mercantile, and spending her evenings at the boarding house or occasionally visiting the Sawyer ranch with Thomas as chaperone. The mercantile owner, Mr. Peterson, was impressed with her neat bookkeeping and gave her more responsibilities each week. Dalton called on her properly, bringing flowers, taking her for chaperoned walks, sitting in Mrs. Henderson's parlor and talking for hours. Winifred learned that he loved the ranch, but sometimes missed the adventure of traveling, that he had a dry sense of humor that caught her off guard and made her laugh, that he was deeply loyal to those he cared about. He learned that she loved reading but rarely had access to books, that she could sew beautifully, that she missed the ocean even though Philadelphia had not been on the coast. "I have never seen the ocean," he admitted one evening as they sat by Mrs. Henderson's fire, Thomas dozing in a chair nearby. "What is it like? Vast, powerful, beautiful and terrifying all at once?" She smiled at the memory. "My mother took me once when I was small. We took the train to Atlantic City. I remember standing at the edge of the water, feeling how big the world was. I would like to see it someday. Maybe you will." He reached across the space between their chairs and took her hand. This had become a habit, this casual touching, and each time it sent warmth through her. "Maybe we will," he corrected softly. "Together." 6 weeks passed this way. Winter began to loosen its grip, and the first signs of spring appeared. Winifred's hands had healed completely, leaving no trace of the frostbite except in her memory. She thought sometimes about that terrifying day and how it had changed everything. She saw Gerald Hutchins once in town. He looked at her with such venom that she took a step back, but Dalton was beside her immediately, his presence solid and protective. Hutchins sneered something under his breath and walked away. "He will not bother you," Dalton said. "I made sure he received repayment for your passage, plus additional compensation for his trouble. You did not have to do that. I wanted to. I wanted to make sure he had no claim on you whatsoever." He looked down at her, his expression serious. "Winifred, there is something I need to tell you." Her heart began to race. "What is it?" "I am in love with you." The words hung in the air between them, simple and profound. She stared at him, at the vulnerability in his face, at the hope in his eyes. "I know it might be too soon," he continued. "I know we agreed to take things slowly, but I cannot keep it to myself anymore. I love you. I think I have loved you since that first day, when you looked at me with such trust, despite having every reason to be afraid. You are brave and kind and strong, and every day I spend with you makes me love you more. I am not asking you to say it back. I just needed you to know." Winifred felt tears stinging her eyes. "You think you have loved me since the first day," he nodded. "Then we have that in common, because I have loved you since you held my hands in yours and promised me everything would be all right." She reached up and touched his face, feeling the roughness of his stubble against her palm. "I love you, Dalton Sawyer. I love your kindness and your strength and the way you make me feel safe and valued and seen." The kiss that followed was soft and sweet, full of promise. When they pulled apart, both were smiling. "Marry me," he said. "Not because you have to, not because you have nowhere else to go. Marry me because you want to build a life with me." "Yes. Yes, absolutely yes." Thomas, who had apparently woken up at some point during their conversation, let out a whoop. "Finally! I have been waiting for you two to figure this out," they laughed, and Winifred felt happiness bubble up inside her, pure and bright. She was going to marry Dalton, but not as a desperate woman with no other choice. She was going to marry him as an equal, as someone who chose him freely because she loved him. The wedding took place 6 weeks later, in the spring of 1878, at the small church in Monticello. It was nothing like the cold ceremony that had been interrupted months before. This time, Winifred wore a dress that she and Mrs. Henderson had sewn together, pale yellow with tiny white flowers embroidered at the cuffs. This time, when she walked down the aisle, she did so with joy in her heart. This time, when the minister asked if she took this man to be her husband, her yes rang out clear and certain, and when Dalton kissed her, sealing their vows, she knew she had made the right choice. The reception was held at the ranch, with neighbors and friends crowding into the house and spilling out into the yard. Someone had a fiddle, and there was dancing. Winifred danced with Dalton, with Thomas, with Mr. Peterson from the mercantile and several of the ranch hands. She laughed more than she had in years, surrounded by people who had become her community, her chosen family. As the sun set, Dalton pulled her away from the crowd, leading her to a small rise behind the house where they could see the mountains in the distance, painted gold and purple by the fading light. "Happy?" he asked, his arm around her waist. "More than I ever thought possible," she said honestly. "When I got on that stagecoach in Philadelphia, I thought I was going to a marriage of convenience, a business arrangement. I never imagined I would find this. Neither did I. I figured I would marry eventually, someone practical and suitable. I never expected to fall in love." He turned her to face him, his hands gentle on her shoulders. "Thank you for saying yes, both times. Thank you for asking, for seeing me when I felt invisible, for warming my hands when I was freezing. Always," he promised, "I will always warm your hands when you are cold. I will always be here for you," and he kept that promise. Through the years that followed, through hardships and joys, through cold winters and warm summers, Dalton was always there. They built the ranch together, expanding slowly but steadily. Thomas eventually married a teacher who moved to Monticello from Denver, and the brothers built a second house on the property so both families could be close but have their own space. Winifred gave birth to their first child, a boy they named Daniel, in the winter of 1879. She had been afraid during the pregnancy, worried about childbirth, but Dalton held her hand through it all, his presence steady and calm. When the midwife placed their son in her arms, and she looked up to see tears streaming down Dalton's face, she knew that their family was complete in a way she had not known was possible. 2 years later, they had a daughter, Margaret, who inherited her father's brown eyes and her mother's determination. 3 years after that came another son, James, who was quieter than his siblings but no less loved. The ranch prospered. They were never wealthy by Hutchins's standards, but they were comfortable and, more importantly, they were happy. Winifred kept the books for the ranch and still helped Mrs. Henderson occasionally. She joined the church ladies group and started a small library in town, using books donated from families and ordered from Denver. Gerald Hutchins eventually married a woman from Salt Lake City, someone as cold and mercenary as himself. Winifred heard they lived in mutual dislike, but stayed together out of stubbornness. She felt sorry for the woman, knowing she had escaped that fate. The years turned into decades. Their children grew, and eventually all three left to seek their fortunes, though Daniel eventually returned to help run the ranch. Winifred and Dalton grew older together, their love deepening with time rather than fading. One winter evening, when they were both in their 60s, Winifred was working in the kitchen when she realized her hands were cold. She had been kneading bread and the house was warm, but her hands had chilled somehow. "Dalton," she called. He appeared in the doorway immediately, as attuned to her as ever. "What is wrong? My hands are cold." He came to her without hesitation, taking her flowery hands in his larger, weathered ones. He held them gently, warming them with his warmth, just as he had done more than 30 years before. "Better?" he asked after a moment. "Better," she agreed, smiling up at him. He did not let go. "Do you remember the first time I did this? Every detail. I was so frightened. I thought I would lose my hands, and then this stranger appeared and promised me it would be all right. I am glad I was there that day. So am I. That was the day my real life began." She squeezed his hands. "Everything good in my life came from that moment. You, the children, this home, this life. All of it started because you stopped to help someone who needed help." "No," he said softly. "It started because you were brave enough to say yes, to take a chance, to trust me." They stood there in the kitchen, hands clasped, looking at each other with the deep knowledge that comes from decades of shared life. Outside, snow was beginning to fall, but inside they were warm. They were home. Their grandson, Daniel's son, came running through the door a moment later, tracking snow and bringing with him the cold wind. "Grandpa, Grandma, come see. It is snowing so hard." They released each other's hands reluctantly and followed him outside. The snow was indeed falling thick and fast, coating the world in white. Winifred stood on the porch, watching their grandson play, and felt Dalton's arm come around her. "Come inside soon," he said. "I do not want you getting frostbite." She laughed, the sound bright in the cold air. "I am not worried. I know you would warm my hands." "Every time," he promised, "for the rest of our lives." And he did. Years later, when Winifred was 75 and Dalton 78, they sat together on that same porch on a spring morning. The children and grandchildren had come for Sunday dinner, and the house behind them was full of noise and laughter. "We have built a good life," Dalton said, his hand finding hers as it always did. "We have built a beautiful life," Winifred corrected. "Better than I ever imagined possible." "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you had married Hutchins?" she considered. "Sometimes. I think I would have survived. I am stronger than I knew back then, but I would never have been happy. I would never have known what it felt like to be truly loved." "You are loved," he assured her, "more than you could ever know." She leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling the solid strength of him, still there after all these years. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun climb higher in the sky, listening to their family inside. That night, after everyone had gone home and they were preparing for bed, Winifred paused at the mirror. Her hair was white now, and her face was lined, but her eyes were bright. She thought about the young woman who had arrived in Monticello with frostbite and no future, who had been so frightened and desperate. That woman seemed like a stranger now, someone from another lifetime. "What are you thinking about?" Dalton asked, coming up behind her. "About how far we have come, about all the good years." He wrapped his arms around her and they looked at their reflection together. "We have many more good years ahead. I hope so. I know so." He kissed the top of her head. "I am not ready to be done warming your hands." She smiled, turning in his arms to face him. "Then I suppose we will have to keep living." "Suppose we will." They lived for many more years, growing old together with grace and love. When Dalton finally passed at the age of 85, it was peacefully in his sleep, with Winifred beside him. She grieved, but she did not regret. They had had a lifetime together, full of love and laughter and partnership. Winifred lived 3 more years after Dalton, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. She spent her days tending her garden, reading and telling stories to the youngest generation about the grandfather they barely remembered. She told them about the day she arrived with frostbite, about how their grandfather had warmed her hands, about the love that had grown from that simple act of kindness. On a cold winter morning, very much like the one on which she had arrived in Monticello all those decades ago, Winifred passed peacefully in her sleep. She was buried beside Dalton, under a stone that read, "Together always." Their children, clearing out the old ranch house, found a wooden box in their mother's dresser. Inside were letters, dried flowers, a pressed leaf from their first spring together, and a pair of worn leather gloves. Attached to the gloves was a note in their mother's neat handwriting. "The gloves Dalton gave me the winter after we married. I never needed them when he was near. His hands were always warm enough." Daniel, now an old man himself, held the gloves carefully. "They really loved each other, did not they?" His sister Margaret, wiping tears from her eyes, nodded. "They showed all of us what love should be. Not just the romance, but the everyday kindness. The way he always reached for her hand. The way she always had coffee ready when he came in from the cold. The way they looked at each other even after 50 years. We should save these," James said quietly, "for the grandchildren, so they know what their great-grandparents had." So the gloves were kept, passed down through the generations along with the story. The story of a mail-order bride who arrived with frostbite, and the cowboy who warmed her hands in his until feeling returned. The story of a love that began with a simple act of kindness and grew into something beautiful and lasting. The ranch itself stayed in the family for generations, and sometimes, on cold winter nights, family members swore they could feel the warmth of that original love still lingering in the old house. Children playing in the kitchen claimed they sometimes saw an old couple standing by the window, hands clasped, looking out at the snow. Whether it was imagination or something more, no one could say. But everyone agreed that if any love was strong enough to echo through time, it was the love between Dalton and Winifred Sawyer. And on the coldest nights, when the wind howled and the snow fell thick, those who lived in the old ranch house said they never felt alone. They felt wrapped in warmth, as though invisible hands were still there, still warming, still caring, still loving. The kind of love that does not die when bodies fail. The kind of love that, once kindled, burns eternal. The story of Dalton and Winifred became part of Monticello's local history. It was told at weddings and anniversaries, held up as an example of what love could be when built on kindness, respect, and genuine care. Young couples starting out would visit the graves, leaving flowers and asking for blessing on their own unions. The town itself grew and changed over the years. The old trading post became a historical landmark. The church where Dalton and Winifred married was restored and preserved. Mrs. Henderson's boarding house was turned into a museum celebrating the history of women in the West, with a whole room dedicated to Winifred's story, her account books from the mercantile, and the dress she had worn to marry the man she loved. But perhaps the most lasting legacy was not in buildings or objects, but in the example they set. They had shown that even in the harsh reality of frontier life, love could flourish. That kindness mattered. That choosing to help someone in need could change not just their life but your own. That sometimes the best things in life come from the chances we take and the hands we reach out to hold. And so the story ended not with sadness but with celebration. A celebration of a life well lived, of love freely given and gratefully received, of a choice made in a moment that echoed through decades, of cold hands warmed by care and a love that, once kindled, never died. In the end, Winifred and Dalton's story was not just about survival or even about romance. It was about the fundamental human need for connection, for kindness, for someone who sees you when you are invisible and reaches out when you are alone. It was about the courage to choose differently, to trust, to love. It was about the extraordinary things that can grow from ordinary acts of compassion. Their great-great-grandchildren, living in a world vastly different from the one Winifred arrived in that cold February day, still told the story. Still kept the gloves. Still visited the graves and left flowers. Still believed in the power of love that begins with warm hands holding cold ones. And on winter nights when the wind was cold and the snow was falling, they remembered. They remembered that feeling could always return, that warmth was always possible, that love could heal even the deepest cold. They remembered that sometimes all it takes is someone willing to stop, to help, to hold your hands in theirs until the feeling comes back. That was the true legacy of Dalton and Winifred Sawyer. Not wealth or fame, but a reminder that love, real love, begins with the simple choice to care, to reach out, to warm cold hands and frozen hearts, to say yes to possibility, to build something beautiful from small moments of kindness. Their story proved that the greatest adventures do not always look like adventures at the start. Sometimes they look like desperation, like fear, like the simple need for help. But from those humble beginnings, extraordinary things can grow. Love can bloom even in the coldest winter. Hope can survive even the darkest times. And two people, strangers once, can build a lifetime together from nothing more than trust and tenderness, and the warmth of hands held together against the cold. That was their gift to the world. That was their story, and it was more than enough.